Okay, thanks for coming today, and for those attending online, hello. Um, so at CP Global Insight, which is the company I co-founded, we look at a lot of Chinese language PRC policy documents and sources. So a very clear example of how this kind of methodology is useful would be with probably the most important thing that China has done on the international stage this year, namely export controls on rare earths. If you have been following the Chinese policy process from 2019 onwards, you would have seen a series of laws and regulations put in place that enabled Beijing this year to take that step. So you can see a system of policies emerging before it's used. And so we're kind of looking around for other areas where this is the case. And one of the things that we see a policy system emerging for is industrial decarbonization. So that's why we think it's important to pay attention to this topic, because it's going to matter more in the future. So I'm trying to make 3 points, basically. Firstly, China is very serious about decarbonization, but it doesn't want to decarbonize in the way that parts of Europe has, like, for example, the UK, where I'm from. A lot of the decarbonization that's happened in the economy has been through the loss of industry to other parts of the world. But China wants to retain a complete industrial system, and so in order to decarbonize its economy, it's going to have to decarbonize industry. And that's especially difficult for heavy industry sectors, which are dominant in China's overall industrial emissions at the moment, and that will require new technologies. The second point that I want to make is that China will not have to deindustrialize industry at its current scale. So as a result of the shrinking population in China, and as a result of the economic maturation, which we're seeing now in the shift away from housing as a driver of growth towards manufacturing, as a result of those kind of trends, the output of steel, cement, glass, and industrial goods of that nature is going to decline in China for the next few decades, at least in terms of volume. And so when you combine that with the goal that China has for emissions reduction by 2035, which is quite a modest 7 to 10% reduction from its peak, it means that over the next decade, China doesn't really have to do anything too dramatic with industry to meet its decarbonization goal. So what is it going to use the next decade for? Well, we see from the policies that have been announced that there is a system being put in place to drive the technological breakthroughs that will be needed later on. And we think that China, because of the way its industrial policy works, has a good chance of making technological breakthroughs in this field. And increasingly, it will be an exporter of standards around industrial decarbonization and technologies. China is already a big exporter of capital and technologies in other green tech sectors. Something similar could happen in technologies to industrialize heavy industry. And that's why it's important, probably as a policy takeaway that is our subjective judgment, it's important to engage with China during these 10 years while these policies are being rolled out and while new technology is emerging, because otherwise in 10 years from now, you might find yourself very surprised by sudden developments in China which are not participating in. And it's interesting to look at Australia as an example of a country that's decided to engage with industrial decarbonization in China. So the first point about Beijing being serious, I think that there's a view in the West very often that decarbonization is a cost. It's something that will make us worse off. In China, the Communist Party has pushed the view that decarbonization is an economic opportunity rather than a threat. And it's also a security opportunity because it allows China to become less reliant on various imported inputs. And this combination of security opportunity and development opportunity is something that we can see, for example, in the next 5-year plan as giving an overall direction to China's economy. And the Communist Party believes it needs to give a sense of a narrative of where China's economy is headed, and that's given under the label of ecological civilization. And importantly in China, the top leader, Xi Jinping, is very invested in this personally. He personally announced China's plan to peak carbon emissions by 2060, and he also personally announced China's 2035 carbon reduction goals. That matters in a top-down system. But as the quotes I've got on the slide indicate, China does not want to lose its old heavy industry sectors. It wants to upgrade them and decarbonize them. That's very clear. And for light industry, it's challenging, but it's not too difficult, because what you can do with light industry is electrify it, and then you can have renewable energy providing the electricity for those sectors. But heavy industry is much more difficult because in many cases, fossil inputs are part of the feedstock. So in steel, for example, coal is generally used in the process of making steel from iron ore. And in other cases, you need very high levels of heat, which currently it's difficult to do with electrification. And then in cases like cement, as a result of chemical reactions that happen, you have direct carbon emissions during the production process. So even if you were somehow to facilitate that with electricity, you'd have to deal with those emissions. And so there need to be a bunch of new technologies that are going to facilitate decarbonization in those sectors. And some of them, we already know what they roughly look like. So using hydrogen in steel production, for example. And then also you've got to reduce the hydrogen using renewable energy, so-called green hydrogen. There are various, it gets quite technical, but there are various ways of making cement in a way that produces fewer emissions by changing the inputs to the process. And then finally, from what you can't, if you can't reduce emissions, you need to somehow capture them or use them. And that's where carbon capture, storage, and utilization comes in. So this is the key point number one. China does not need to decarbonize industry at its current scale. So I've got here a chart which is Bausteel's projection for steel demand in China over the next few decades. And you can see that they see steel demand has already peaked and it's going to gradually decline over the next few decades. And Baosteel is actually very bullish in their forecast. Other Chinese think tanks predict a much more steep decline in steel production. And cement production has already declined very steeply, and it will continue to do so. And that means, as I said, the 2035 goal that Xi Jinping announced just a couple of months ago is pretty easy to reach. So we see incremental change over the next 5-year plan that goes to 2030, and then probably also over the next decade. And we see Beijing putting in place a system to drive the faster transition in technology that will be needed after 2035. And there is a proven playbook to some extent that Beijing can draw on. We know that industrial policy has achieved successes in electric vehicles, in solar panels, and in batteries. And there are many things that Beijing will do in these sectors which are similar to what it's done previously. And I think it's important to emphasize that in China you have a mix of state support for firms entering a new sector, and there's a tolerance from the financial system of losses over a long period. You can think of it as kind of the Silicon Valley model in China, where you can make losses for a long time. But there's also fierce competition between companies from different parts of the country. And so you don't just have single state champions that are picked by Beijing. You have intense competition. And in this process, I think, yep.
Take questions now, or would you prefer after?
I think after, yeah. I think the role of the state-owned financial system needs to be emphasized in China's industrial policy playbook. So having most of the main banks being state-owned is very important for coming up with the financial capital for decarbonization. And it's not that state banks are purely operating on state direction. They're also market-driven. They are basically hybrid entities between the state and the market. And they are guided also by the central bank, which has a very active green monetary policy. And they are also guided by various catalogs that come out of agencies like the NDRC, which basically say you should invest in these sectors, you shouldn't invest in these other sectors. Here are a list of technologies that we think are good. Go and invest in projects using those technologies. But it's not specified what exactly the projects or the company should be, just the areas. So this guiding of state financing is very important. And it's something that is lacking in Europe, for example. And then another element of the system is we noticed that China has created a huge range of standards around measuring carbon emissions, around defining different technologies, and we've compiled these into our report that we wrote on this for the German Industry Association, which I'm able to share. And basically every ministry is heavily involved in releasing standards for decarbonizing industry. There's an aim to create a carbon footprint system for all products, and there's various other standards involved. Also part of the industrial policy playbook is the use of pilots and the use of local experimentation. So the net zero industrial parks that are being set up are part of this system. Plus there are national green tech demonstration projects, which if they are successful will be scaled up. If they're not successful, they get abandoned. And then the final element that we see coming into place over the next 5 years is the carbon market, which is going to be expanded to basically cover the entire industrial system over the next 5 years. We don't think that the carbon market is really over the next 5 years about driving emissions reduction. It's more about gathering data because the emissions caps that are going to be used are going to be quite generous. So just as an example of the emissions accounting standards that have been released in recent years, there's an absolute flood of these. And you can really dig into the details. These are extremely detailed and they are mandatory standards for industry. So just keeping track of these, I think, is important because increasingly Chinese standards could become global standards in this area. And why are we somewhat bullish on the idea that the Chinese government can effectively deploy industrial policy in decarbonizing industry? Well, I think that the examples that I gave earlier of EVs, batteries, and solar are examples of where Chinese industrial policy basically works best. So Chinese industrial policy tends to be more successful in areas which are emerging and which don't have international incumbent companies that Chinese companies have to catch up with. So within China, this is called overtaking on the curve. So the idea is that when technology shifts, everyone starts out on a more level playing field, and that gives Chinese companies an opportunity. And industrial decarbonization technology is also emerging. There are no international leaders yet in these areas. And so judging by the past, it seems like there's a decent chance of success. The other factor, I think, that supports being bullish, apart from the state's, in the fact that the state considers this to be very important, is just the scale of China's industrial output. So China produces about 1 billion tons of steel a year. In a country like Germany, it's more like 50 million. So that just the scale difference is enormous. But then I want to add a couple of reasons for caution. So from our conversations with Chinese industry, one thing that comes up is that SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are very dominant in heavy industry, and they are going to have to lead a lot of this innovation. And private sector players, for example, in steel, are generally reluctant to deploy these technologies. And one thing that we know about Chinese economy is that private sector tends to be more innovative. However, it's not the case that SOEs are not innovative at all. We have cases, for example, the state grid, which has been very successful with ultra-high voltage transmission technologies. We also have the state-owned oil companies, which, judging by their patent output, are quite innovative. And so it's possible for SOEs to innovate, but it's probably a headwind. And the other thing that's going on is this issue of overcapacity in industrial sectors. So that's reducing prices and profits for everybody, and it's reducing then the resources that companies have to fund R&D. So to give an example, to make it a bit more concrete about what's going on in China, the steel sector. So one pillar of decarbonizing the steel sector is about transitioning from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which recycle steel. And there's a huge potential to do this in China. Scrap steel volume is growing very rapidly. Electricity prices are coming down very rapidly. And you can obviously fuel this in theory with renewable generated electricity. However, China's not been successful in meeting its 2025 target of electric arc furnace generation. And we think this is basically because of the involution issue that is going on in the Chinese steel sector. So if you've got lower prices, that means that electric arc furnace steel is less competitive. And so in our view, Beijing's drive to sort out the involution problem in industry is quite closely linked to this decarbonization goal. And it's something that we don't see happening in the next few years. This is a 5 to 10 year project. Also, notably, China has set up a very large SOE, again, to centralize scrap steel collection. So that's something that people in the industry see as important. We already have quite a lot of experimentation going on, pilot projects with new technologies, notably a very pioneering project in hydrogen-based steel. And we have new ideas about financing. So I mentioned China's state-backed financial system as a key asset in its previous industrial policy. Some of the challenges with decarbonizing industry are a little bit different from what Chinese financial system is used to. So Chinese financial system is very used to financing the building of new things and scaling up existing technologies very rapidly. But with green industrial decarbonization, the challenge is often not about building the new, but it's about converting existing plants into more green plants. And so there's a lot of talk in China and thinking about transition finance and how banks are going to do this. So this is an emerging area as well. Carbon capture and storage, it's a controversial technology, I think, amongst some decarbonization advocates. But in China, the direction is clear that this is seen as a key part of the strategy for industrial decarbonization. And we have a number of projects, particularly in cement. As I mentioned earlier, in the cement production process, you have the release of carbon emissions directly. And so you've got to do something with those emissions. So that's why cement has been selected for a number of pilots in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Once again, SOEs are leading. China's set up a central SOE consortium to work on technology in this sector. And there are a number of regional pilot projects. So in our view, then, we don't expect rapid progress over the next, in technologies, maybe over the next 5 years, but we would not be surprised if by the mid-2030s, China had made advances that put it to the forefront of decarbonizing industry. And so we think that it's a good idea for foreign countries to try and engage with China now, to try and understand what's happening, and to some extent to shape what's happening. And an interesting example of a country that decided to do that this year was Australia. So Australia is a huge exporter of iron ore to China. It's very important for its economy, and it sees the writing on the wall with the decarbonization of the steel sector, and it's decided that it wants to get inside the tent and try and understand and steer this process. And since green steel requires different kinds of iron ore, basically higher grade iron ore, that's why this policy dialogue was set up, and which will start next year. And the idea is that Australia can help shape this process. And it's also an economic self-interest argument that it wants to make sure that it has a continued place within China's steel sector. And you can think of, Australia is obviously a commodity exporter. In Europe, there's fewer commodity exports, but there are still a lot of steel technology-related exports. And so at the very least, it's important to understand and to fund more research on what is going on. And I think it's also important to think about what happens maybe 10 years from now if China is setting standards in these technologies and exporting them. Okay, so just to do a bit of self-promotion, this is all based on research that I've done with my partner Erland, and we set up a company which is really focused on looking at Chinese industrial policy. And the idea is that I think we're all basically flooded with information. There's an endless amount of news, substacks, policy documents, and we want to try and explain systematically what's going on and the why of why China is releasing the policies that it releases. So I think I can finish there. Thank you.